So today we're going to talk about writing because I'm celebrating my first year of fiction writing, and I can't believe it's been a year. I started writing on a daily basis on January the 1st, 2025, and 366 days later, I'm here to celebrate. And so I'm going to talk about the things that I've learned, the things that I've done, the struggles, the hiccups, but also the successes and especially the joy. And of course, we can also talk about tools. So here's a question about any tools for writing. Are you using anything like Scrivener or Campfire, Word, Anvil? No, actually, I just use usually Pages, which is a standard app that comes with any Mac. That is to say, I was using that for the majority of the year until I lost an entire document. So at one point I'd been writing, and apparently there's no autosave, or at least not a reliable one. And so the program crashed, and I think I wrote like an entire chapter of a book, and it was gone, and it was irretrievable. It was nowhere to be found. That was when I was like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. So now I write either in Google Docs, or I write straight into Substack, which is actually really, really nice. I love the kind of the writing environment of Substack. It's very plain, simple, but especially for the short stories, I just love typing it straight into the article. Because then I would also have a feel of how it would look on the page if someone would be reading that text. And a lot of what I write is to be consumed online or on a device or on a monitor. I don't know, it just helped me to get closer to the end result. Whereas with Google Docs, of course, it's much more like an old-fashioned word processor, and what you see on the screen might look very different in its ultimate publication form. And then very recently, for this last book that I've written in the month of December, so Advent of Dragons, I wrote that in an app called Reedsy. It's actually an online service, Reedsy, Reedsy, Reedsy.com. It's free, and it's got a lot of good. It's geared towards fiction writers, and so it comes, for instance, with you can have someone else do editing or editorial corrections, and it will show up, and you can actually agree with it or correct. It's got a lot of those really fancy features that normally you would have to purchase Word for, Microsoft Word. And what is also cool is that it allows you to format it straight to a file that you can upload to Amazon KDP or any other distribution platform. So it does all the heavy lifting when it comes to formatting your book, which is also kind of nice. I like the simplicity. It's not super fancy. There's just a few options, but I think it all looks good. So why not? Why not use it? So that's basically, I'm only using free tools right now. But I used to use Scrivener. Oh, that's probably more than 6 years ago. No, it's longer than that, like 10 years ago, when I wrote Geek Priest, which was my first autobiographical book. And everybody was talking about Scrivener, so I wrote it with Scrivener. And it was a little bit overpowered for what I needed it for. But a lot of people swear with, how do you say that? That's probably a Dutchism. But they really think for them Scrivener is the best option. I've started to really like Reedsy also because of the automatic backup. It's all in the cloud. It can't be it can't just disappear, which it doesn't happen that often, but when it happens, it's pretty disastrous. It's just a lot of work. When you write a chapter, that's hours and hours of writing and correcting, and then it's gone, and you have to kind of reproduce it from memory. Not fun. So let's talk about New Year's resolutions when it comes to writing before I dive into the overview of what this first year of writing brought me. I I would like to, and I know that I should not make real like big commitments. For me, it works best to just have a wish list of things that I want to focus on more, but without the pressure. And one of the things I'd like to do more is do this kind of stuff. Just talk about stories and talk about writing. I've done podcasting for 20 years now, 25 years, probably 20 years, because it was 20 years. But anyway, and I did a lot of live streaming, and it was always a lot of fun. For a while, I did just Q&As on YouTube. That was fun as well. And so I want to pick that up again. The reason that I didn't do it was actually very simple. It was just a technical reason. The cabin downstairs, it's basically the closet where people used to hang their coats. I transformed that into a small office. But the audio is not very good there. It's very, very echoey, and there's no good light. There's not much. I mean, the light here is not very good either, but it's a lot better than what I have downstairs. So now that this is back in place, I think I can do way more of these kind of fireside chats. Don't really have a fireplace though, but because I think it's a very good way to have a kind of a more longer conversation. The videos like this don't go viral, of course. The algorithm is still geared towards short form, and that's totally fine. But what I think works best for me is kind of engage more in depth and have longer conversations, or at least a little bit more room to just chat without that pressure of like, okay, here are 5 points and stick around for the 5th one because it's going to change your life, that kind of stuff, which is very much catering to algorithms, which, has its function, and I will certainly do that as well. But what I hope is that I can bring people to my long form content, which is these chats and longer conversations. Podcasts. I have some podcasting plans that I'm very excited about. Not just the Saints podcast, but also some story related podcasts. I'll talk about that maybe later. And then, of course, to my books, the chapters, the short stories, all that is long form. If you read a chapter of my book, it will take you 15 minutes. So I'm aiming for an audience that actually can do that without getting bored, which is obviously, a subset of the people that I could reach if I were to do only the short form content. But short form content is really exhausting because to make it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of scripting. It kind of takes away the spontaneity as well, which I like about these conversations. And it's a machine. You have to keep feeding it, and you're just going for optimizing all the time. It's there are times in my life that I have the energy to do that, but when you're juggling so many projects as I'm doing right now, I just don't want to bother. So, by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I don't think that I'm able to see, now that I think of it, the Substack comments, because I only see right now YouTube comments. So what I can do is go to my own website, my own Substack that is, and see if I can put the stream on mute or something like that. Yeah, actually, there it is. So I see the live stream. I have 18 people watching, but I don't know if they're watching on YouTube or if they're watching on Substack. I assume this is just for YouTube. But I don't see any comments here. How do I get the comments? If I click on this. Oh, yeah, there we go. Now I have live chat open, but I don't see any comments here. How do I get the comments? If I click on this. Oh, yeah, there we go. I don't want to have a conversation with myself, so I'm going to mute myself. So here's a question. If you are watching this on Substack, could you do me a favor and post a comment? It can just be an emoji if you're shy, but just let's see if the comments on Substack also show up in my streaming software, or if I have to open a window every time I go live on Substack. So Maybe nobody's watching on Substack. That's fine as well. As usual, I haven't been streaming for months. And so I will just give it some time and just show up regularly. And over time, I'm pretty sure that people will also show up as well. Steve says, I just noticed that you are on. Happy New Year from San Diego. It's good to see you. Now I know which Steve that is. Hope you had a good New Year. It's funny because we're streaming. I'm streaming this at 8, almost 9 o'clock in the evening. But of course, I think now everybody is in 2026. But earlier today, like half of the world was still in 2025. So it's very funny to always have this weird. And then sometimes people are watching and they're already on the next day. They're watching from New Zealand, for instance. Time zones. It's crazy. So let's talk about 1 year of writing. I started writing on January the 1st, 2025, and I started basically on a whim. I didn't get the idea to start writing on a daily basis on January the 1st. I got the idea a lot earlier in the fall. I was at a fantasy convention. And back then I was interviewing people for my YouTube channel. So I've got a couple of YouTube channels, but I wanted to start a YouTube channel focused on stories and on fantasy. And so for that, I was interviewing some Dutch authors in English. And after interviewing a couple of them, they asked me, well, have you ever thought of writing? I was like, no, come on. I'm too old for that. I should have started like 30 years ago. I'm more of a visual guy. I do television. I'm an audio guy. I do podcasting. But then they asked me, but would you like to, do you have a story that you've never written down, and then I had to pause. It's like, well, actually, now that you mention it, it used to be my dream as a child. I wanted to become a children's book author. And it was because I loved reading myself. And I thought that a lot of the books that were written for children were bad and boring. And I was a huge fan of stories like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and The Wizard of Oz, and later on The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And especially in the Netherlands, there weren't that many books for children that were fantasy or science fiction based. And so I remember that when I was definitely in primary school, maybe even in secondary school, that was one of the many options I considered for my future. And then I never did anything with it. But then when they asked me that question, it continued to haunt me. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, why not? I started to watch YouTube videos like of other writers. How do I write a book? Of course, I had written a few nonfiction books, like some philosophy stuff and some thesis work for my studies, the occasional article here and there. And of course, I wrote my autobiography more than 10 years ago now, called Geek Priest. And it was basically my adventures in the world of media and Star Wars. And it was a lot of fun to write that. But since then, I never really took the time to write. And so I think for about a month and a half, I was pondering about, well, if I were to ever write a book, what would it be about? And then I went to, I think I went to Ireland, and I was visiting all these beautiful places, and some of them had ruins of old monasteries, and then a story started to emerge, and it was like a historical fantasy, and it would have magicians, monks that were actually able to perform magic using storytelling. So stories is not just to convey information or to entertain people, but in that story, in my mind, you could actually, the things that you would make up would actually happen if you were a true story mage. And then I started to think about that and develop a bit of a theology behind it. And that got so specific that I knew that I had a story there. I knew I had a book. And so I was, I was, I was so enthusiastic about the world that started to emerge in my imagination. I was like, okay, the only thing I need to do now is to just sit down and write it. And that is where, changing from the 31st of December to the 1st of January, I like moments like that to make a new commitment. And so I really remember putting a little table in the closet downstairs, and I think it was the Mac, or maybe it was even an old PC or whatever, put up a monitor, and I started to write. And I vowed that I would write every single day of the year. For 1 year, I would write every day. I had no idea if that was even remotely possible, but it's like all good intentions for the new year. You got to start somewhere, and then we'll see how it goes. And oftentimes when I make commitments like that at the start of the year, after a couple of weeks, it starts to sag. I start to skip a day, and I basically fall off the wagon, like I think most of us do. But not with writing. I so loved writing, and it was so much fun to see this world start to take shape, and there were characters, and they had a life of their own and a will of their own. And the second thing that really helped me was to blog about, or to vlog about it. So I didn't have a Substack at the time, but I did have some YouTube channels. I did have a TikTok channel. So I figured, you know what? Let me just start a new channel on YouTube. It's going to be basically a BookTube channel. I'm going to talk about books that I read and books that I write. And that's how it got started. And I forced myself, after writing for about an hour or 2 hours, I would just always film something, just an update. No matter how, I wasn't aiming for quality. I wasn't even thinking beforehand what I would say, but I just wanted to chronicle the process of writing. And I wasn't really expecting anyone to watch it because I didn't put much effort in it. But the fact that after each writing session, I had that moment of accountability where I put myself out there and said, hey, today I wrote this many words, or I came up with this amazing idea. That, I think, was also extremely helpful in establishing this writing routine. And the thing with routines is once you have it in place, once you've done something for about 2 months, it just sticks, at least in my case. And so writing every day, most of what I wrote at the time, I've thrown away. It's just absolutely terrible. But that's not a problem, because I knew that I was still learning. I like everything, you got to start somewhere. But I kept writing. I kept revising. I fell into all the beginner's traps, in the sense that I started rewriting the first chapter. I like 5 times, 6 times, 10 times, and it didn't get any better. And then I started to plot. I was like, okay, I need to learn about story structure. So I started to study the various structures that you have, thinking that if I would only study other authors well enough, then of course I would learn the craft as well. I wasn't even considering that I wasn't even thinking about what is my way of writing. I just figured I'll just copy the best. And so I read the Stephen King book on writing. I read a lot of the Save the Cat structure, and just a basic 3-act structure. How do you build up character arcs? I was living and breathing tutorials, writing tutorials. And I'm very glad that I did, because it was like a crash course in storytelling. And what I loved is that I could apply it right away. So every time I'd watch the tutorial, I would try stuff out in my book. So I did that for about 2 months. Gathered quite a following on YouTube. I mean, relatively small, but still a couple of hundred people were watching those early vlogs, and I got some super encouraging feedback from people. People were extremely kind and patient, probably also. But it was just lovely to have that back and forth conversation. And I think that too, knowing that people were actually watching the videos, helped me to stay focused. Now, after a couple of months, I think about 3 months, I still wasn't anywhere. I had kind of a vague idea of what the story should be about. The plot was very ambitious. If I look at those early drafts of the plot, I think I wanted to have like 36 chapters. But it's material that now, in hindsight, that would take 3 or 4 books. You know, I crammed way too much in that first plot. But that's not a problem. It just helped me to build a world and to mess around. But at one point, I just felt I got stuck. I just didn't have the routine yet and the experience to pull it off. The story was too big. The world was too big. And that's when I started my Substack. And I always thought that Substack was basically a website for journalists. And I was following some theologians on Substack, but it was always the very serious stuff. It's more information. But a friend of mine actually had a Substack, and he sometimes would post chapters or short stories. And I was like, oh, that is something I can do. And I love the idea, again, of accountability. I knew that if I would put something on Substack, people would read it. And so I'd have to do my best to write something that was worth reading. And that was like at least, not full of grammatical and spelling errors. So that's when I started to experiment with short stories. I started with children's stories. Like I wanted to become a children's book writer when I was young. And so I started to write a few tales. And this was around the time of the election of the new Pope, Pope Leo. And so I wrote some stories about animals in Rome. It's very simple stuff, fun to write, nothing too ambitious. But I noticed that I liked these ultra short stories because they were mostly, I think you call them flash fiction. So a short story that can still be, 20, 30 pages. What I wrote was basically 2 pages and then tried to do a little arc, have one problem, one main character. And writing for kids also was freeing because I didn't have to worry about trying to be too fancy. It's just, I'm telling you a fun story, with cats, with dogs, with whatever. Seagulls. And then I got the hang of it and I started to experiment with fairy tales. I started to write short stories about gnomes and fairies and elves and whatnot. And that brought me back to my childhood years as well, where I always loved to read fairy tales. And I continue to write short stories. At the same time, I was also still working on the big book, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And so I tried. The fun thing with the short stories was I could try out all sorts of genres. So I started with a lot of fairy tale, fantasy kind of stuff. And then I gradually, a lot of those stories actually took place in the same imaginary world that I created for my first book. But then I wanted to try out other stuff, so I did a science fiction story. I at one point wanted to write some pirate stories, which was also it was inspired by what I was reading at the time, and I had just read a young adult pirate story which I loved, and so I was like, okay, let's try my hand at a pirate story. And I think there was actually a chaplain of a pirate boat who was the protagonist. There are a lot of monks in my stories. And so, I don't know, it was just, I love the fact that every day there would be a new story. And that's also how I discovered my own writing method, or what worked best for me. And it was a combination of walking and writing. I like to run. I'm fortunate enough to live very close to the woods, so I always would go and for a run at least a couple of times per week. And then I started to go on these walks, and I taught myself how to dictate my stories. And it wasn't really because I'm not good at typing. I've been typing my entire life, so I can type very fast. But it was just different. I noticed that if I'm moving my body, it's easier to come up with ideas. That's why I do most of my podcasts also while I'm walking outside. It's a different, I don't know, my brain reacts to it very well. So I started to basically tell myself stories, recording it on my iPhone. And at first, as you can imagine, that's very hard, and you feel extremely self-aware. And I wasn't comfortable like doing the punctuation and everything. However, it did over time get easier and easier. And now I'm at the point where I can actually dictate an entire chapter. And of course, there will be mistakes in there, and sometimes I'll have to kind of reformulate something, or I'll record myself saying, okay, scratch this doesn't work. Let's go back to this point in the story and let me take it from there. But what I liked is at the same time, I was walking every day. I was walking for 2 hours. So in terms of my health was really good. I was really fit, and also mentally it was wonderful. So what I then kind of developed is, okay, how do I get the spoken word onto Substack? And I found this amazing app on the Mac, which is called Mac Whisper. It's very cheap software, and it's brilliantly good in transcribing English or any language, basically. You download these big LLMs, so these large language models, and it uses that to analyze your speech. So it is, in a way, a form of an application of AI, but the accuracy was out of this world, and it adds the interpunction and everything. So I didn't have to say like period or exclamation point. It just looks at the text and it guesses where the punctuation should be. Once I had the transcripts, I could then start to work on it. So I would then paste it into Readsy or straight into Substack, and then you can just juggle around. But it's so much faster to work on a text that is already written out than sitting there and having to produce every new sentence. And so the editorial process also was accelerated by this method, and I noticed that it added something to the writing process. So thinking about the plot, usually my walk starts with, okay, so what's the story going to be? And I take about 10 minutes, and then something comes up, and I have usually a beginning of an idea, and then I'll just start narrating it. And the funny thing is, especially with the short stories, the story just emerges. I don't have to deliberately think about what is going to happen next. I just tell the story. It happens, and I just voice what happens in the story. I have the same thing with preaching in church. I don't prepare my homilies. I don't have to. I just read the stories in the Bible that I have to comment on. I usually get an idea or a story or an anecdote or an image, and I just start talking, and a homily comes out. And it's the same thing with the short stories, and including the ending. And sometimes I'm just listening to myself telling the story, and I was like, oh, I did not see that coming. And it's so amazing how the brain works, and how sometimes your subconscious already knows what is going to happen, whereas consciously I am not aware. I'm still too focused on formulating the phrases. But that gave me a lot of confidence. But then when you go and you sit down in front of the computer and you start editing it, there is an other part of your brain that gets activated. It's more the analytical part. And so that helped, that accelerated my ability to analyze my own writing. to see sometimes the repetitiveness of what I write, or the filler words, or what even dialogue was hard at the beginning because I've never written dialogue before. And it was in the editorial process that I started to learn how to write dialogue and to keep it short and to the point. And over time, I think I started to develop my own style of writing, which is pretty down to earth. I'm very sensory in my writing, so I like to imagine how something smells, how something feels, what it looks like, if I'm cold or warm, and that helps a lot in creating an atmosphere. So I'm not very much of a literary writer. I don't try to be too fancy in what I write or use like metaphors all the time. I think over time I've started to become more and more kind of down to earth, but very sensory based, so that if you read the story, hopefully you will kind of smell what the woods smell like, or you, especially with the last book that I wrote, there's a lot of eating, there's a lot of hot chocolate in there, so I had to kind of convey that, and that's kind of currently my style. So the short stories were extremely formative for this process. And that gave me the courage to go back to the book. And we're now already in the month of May, and I knew that I had to do something to finish the story. I'd already decided to cut the plot into 3 parts, so I'd write a trilogy based on the original structure of the book that I constructed. But I knew that I had to go into a focus mode unlike anything I was able to do at home. So I decided to go on a writing retreat, and I went back to the place where the story emerged, which was Ireland. And so I went for a month to Ireland, stayed in youth hostels, traveled to a few places, did a lot of hiking. And it was actually there was 1 week where I wrote the most. And that was the week that I was at Glendalough, which is an old monastic city. Now only ruins are left. It's in a beautiful environment, surrounded by hills. The nature over there is amazing. And for about 7 days, I went on 8 to 10 hour hikes per day. So I would wake up, get my breakfast, make some lunch, pack it, and I would go and I would walk. And I sometimes would write 4, 5, or 6 chapters during those walks. The only thing I did was just walk until I was tired. And so in that 1 week, I think I finished the entire book. Was it any good? No, it wasn't good. But I got through the story. What I learned was to push through. With short stories, it's much easier to get excited and to write it down and to feel good about it. With a long book, and this is also just lack of experience, there were so many times, especially in the second act, where I was like, okay, so what's going to happen next? I don't know anything. I'm bored. What can I do? But then I was like, okay, I'm just going to continue walking. Something will come up. I will figure it out. And I did. Every time there was at least something that started to emerge, and then I recorded a new chapter. I would immediately transcribe that at home at the hostel. And so I ended up with about 60,000 words at the end of my stay in Ireland. It's not much. Definitely not enough, but it was a finished story. And then I did, I think, what is the smartest thing that I've ever done in this last year. I shelved it. I didn't look at it anymore. It's done. The story is there. Let it mature. And also, let me just do something else, just to continue to hone my skills. So I went back to writing short stories every day. And those stories were also compounding. So you can still read all of them on my Substack. They're in the short story category. If you add them together. So I started to add those stories to a new document in Reedsy. Reedsy is a service that I use for writing and for formatting, but it has word count, which is super useful. It has all sorts of search and replace functionality, and it's so I'm so glad I put it in there because it will make the rest of the process much easier. But I started to count words, and then at one point I had 70,000 words, and all short stories. So I was like, that's a book. That is an anthology. I can publish this. And because I had already published them on Substack, they already went through at least an initial revision and an initial editing process. Now, of course, it's never good to do your own line editing because you will get word blind, and maybe even like the developmental editing, which is, does this story make sense? Does it miss anything? Is it logical or not? It really helps to have other people read it as well. But I knew that I had enough stories for one book, and then I started to write different stories, darker stories. And this was deliberate because a lot of the fairy tales that I'd written were more like they all ended well. But sometimes I had these stories that emerged where the ending was ambiguous, a bit more in the Twilight Zone type of stuff, or like Stephen King type of stories. And I didn't feel comfortable putting those in the same collection as the feel-good stories or the fantasy stories. And so I was like, well, what if I make like stories of light and stories of darkness? And I started to think of like a Canterbury Tales type of frame story that I could create for those two collections. And one book would be these kind of Twilight Zone stories, the darker ones, and the other one would be just the fairy tales. So I focused on the darker stories, and again had at one point 70,000 words worth of stories. So that's 2 books. I could just put them together, maybe create a little frame story to position them. So that was 2 books. So I had 1 draft, 2 second drafts, you could say. The short stories definitely need some editing, but they're much further ahead than the first story. And then I was like, okay, I want to write another book. I had written 1 short story about a girl who passes her driver's license exam, but not in car, but on a dragon. That's just this wacky idea. What if you you get your driver's license, but instead of a car, you have a dragon? I loved writing that story. It was one of the stories that I enjoyed the most. I was super happy with the result. And then it got its life of its own. I was like, okay, well, what if? Why does she get that driver's license? What's she going to do next? And then immediately I knew that I wanted to write a procedural story. So basically like a cop show, but then with dragons instead of police cars. And that is how the idea got started for Dragon Patrol, which is a more urban fantasy, takes place in a big fantasy city. And my protagonist, or the protagonist of that short story, now joins a team of young dragon riders, or they're kind of adults, but young adults. I didn't want to write a young adult novel because it limits me to a certain category of readers. So the characters in the book deliberately are like in their 20s, maybe even a bit older. But anyway, what I did was every chapter was a case, and I studied TV formats. So I was watching a TV show called Rookies, which is amazing, by the way, highly recommended. And I started to see the pattern. Every episode had the same type of pattern. And I recognized it from Star Trek. Star Trek has the same thing. If you watch Star Trek The Next Generation, almost every episode has the same five or six elements. So there's usually like a cold open where there's a problem or a murder or something. And then you have the first examination, what's going on, what happened, and then they start deliberating, and then of course it turns out to be something different, so there's deepening of the mystery, and then you have the confrontation, the big whatever fight or pursuit, or and then you have like an epilogue. You basically have, it's in Star Trek, it's usually when they're playing poker, together. It's this little scene that just deepens the characters and the relationships. And I figured, you know what, that is a format I can work with. So I'll just start telling stories about those dragon patrols, these young dragon riders. We'll just create a kind of a police procedural. And what I loved about it is it combined a bigger framework of a urban fantasy novel with this kind of short story tension arc, or how do you say that? Like story arcs. I wrote an entire book in 3 weeks, I think. 3 or 4 weeks. It was about a month. And then I had, every chapter was 5,000 words. It was very methodical, like always 5,000 words. Then it has to be wrapped up. And then while I was telling these individual stories that happened during those chapters, I started to think of a backstory and how does it all tie together. So it's the bigger mythology. And then I distinctly remember that towards the end, I started to divide those chapters over the classic 3-act structure. And then later on, I think I went more for Save the Cat. So Save the Cat is basically the framework of almost any Hollywood movie. And I started to rearrange the chapters and the events in the Dragon Patrol book on, you know, in the kind of in the structure of a Hollywood movie. And then automatically I realized this is in the same world as my early medieval story. It's I don't know how, but I am going to bring these worlds together. And I think I know how I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to spoil it yet. Because, of course, the first novel takes place or starts in Ireland. But maybe it won't stay in Ireland. Anyway, so that was a fantastic experience. And the Dragon Patrol book, the first draft, is 100 million times better than the first draft of my Story Mages book. So it taught me that I think mostly because of the short stories, I'd become much better into writing into the dark, basically just figuring it out as I went. Then I, again, went back to the short stories. And then I got the idea of, and now we're already past the summer vacation. There was this month called Inktober. And the challenge is to draw something in ink every single day. And so I wanted to pick up drawing again, also something that I hadn't done in 30 years. And I loved having just a keyword every day and then just make a drawing. But while I was drawing, I got ideas for stories. And so I was like, okay, let's just write a short story every single day based on that keyword and on the drawing that I make. 1 month later, I had 30 chapters. I had 65,000 words. That's another book. That's another anthology. So now I had three anthologies of short stories. And then I wanted to go back to the monks. I wanted to go back to the Story Mages, but instead of revising the first book that I wrote, I just didn't dare to read it again. I was like, okay, I know it's not very good, but I also had, in the meantime, developed a lot of ideas about the world and the backstory. And so when Inktober was finished, so then I already had basically 5 drafts already. Dragon Patrol, Story Mages, and 3 anthologies. And also the children's book. I don't even count that, but that's also, I mean, that's probably not a full novel length book, but still, I could probably just make some illustrations and put it on the market as well. But I won't count that one. So I was so enjoying the process of writing a story every day that for November, I came up with this idea. Well, what if I just write basically a novella that is a prequel to the Story Mages book? and I will tell the story of the father of the protagonist. And there are many reasons why I wanted to write that story. And I had this idea, well, what if it is a bit like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them? So it's not really a book in the series, but it is something you can read along, and it will deepen the world, or it will introduce people to the world. And at first I was just thinking of that story as a lead magnet. So something I would just write, put it up on Substack. So if people want to subscribe to my newsletter, they would have an incentive because they would get the book for free. They could download it. So I was initially just thinking about something like, 25,000 words, novella length. So I started, and I did what I did with Dragon Patrol. I just started telling the story. I had no plan. I had no structure. I just had the name of the protagonist, and I knew it was a prequel. And I started telling this story, and it was so easy to write, because now at least I knew how to keep people on, turning the pages. I knew how to do cliffhangers. I knew how to create interesting characters. I knew that my strength was in writing ensemble teams. So not just one protagonist, but always a protagonist with friends and side characters. There's a lot of fun in writing the interaction and the dialogue between various characters. And so I started writing, and the idea was, the concept was, it's going to be a diary. It's a found diary. So it's basically the notes of this father. He's been on this journey, and every page or every chapter will be the notes in his little travel book. That's what I thought. So the opening chapter is this old monk who finds this old ancient chest at the bottom of the bell tower, and he opens it and he finds this diary and he starts reading it. And then the kind of the idea was that, or the frame story was that what we read is basically his narration of these notes. So it's embellished a little bit. And so I started writing this big journey. And then soon I had a crew of 4 or 5 characters. And I started to really enjoy the story, and I had so many ideas. And I kept writing every day. Again, I made the chapters a little bit shorter than Dragon Patrol, so about 3,500 words per chapter. And I did that every single day of the month of November. And on November the 30th, the entire book was finished. Total length, 110,000 words. What? I did, and it was a really good story. It is, again, started writing into the dark, no idea where the story would take me. When I was at the halfway point, I knew I was in trouble, because I knew structurally that I had to start bringing the story together and starting to give the payoff of everything I'd set up in the beginning. And so I continued to plot and to write. So it became a mix of just writing into the dark, but also every time I would ask myself, okay, so I need to get to this point in the story. How do I get there? So I was like, this is where I want to end at the end of Act 2. What are the steps that I need to take to get to that point? That was very helpful, to start with the ending and then work backwards. And then the finale, that was the hardest thing. That was so complicated also because I was doing world building at the same time. I started to develop so many concepts for the universe. And it was definitely the hardest thing to write, much harder than Dragon Patrol. But also once it was finished, I was so proud. I was like, this is a novel. Now I'm there. This is a book. Of course, it's a draft, so it needs a lot of work. but it is already so much better than the first book. In fact, because it's a prequel, and now it's a full-fledged book, I might even start publishing this book and then rewrite the first one. I'm sure it will be a lot easier because I understand the world a lot better. So, once that was finished, on the 30th of November, December came along, and I was on such a roll. I was like, okay, I have now written 6 books. Well, 3 novels and then 3 anthologies, but still, if I publish this on Amazon, there will be 6 books. That's not bad for 1 year. Do I have it in me to write one more book? I've got 1 more month, 1 more book. And then I had this idea, what if I write a short book, like a novella? It's going to be super simple. Let's just write a cozy fantasy. And I was really thinking of something 30,000 words. Maybe even, again, a book that I would just give away for free. And then I was like, okay, what if I write this for charity? Let's do like an advent calendar thing. I'm going to write a short chapter every day, and I'm going to post it on Substack right away. And then I'll figure it out as I go along. And then I invite people to sponsor a chapter, and then that goes to support a fundraiser of a friend or like a fellow author, fantasy author that I interviewed more than a year ago now. So she's a relatively young writer, but she also has serious health issues. She needs to get expensive surgery in Spain, which is not reimbursed here by the Dutch healthcare system. And so she had started a fundraiser a while ago, and I figured, you know what, why not support her? And let me just give it a try. So I started writing into the dark. I'll just make it up as I go. I have only read 2 cozy fantasy novels, and I liked what I read, but I also felt it was sometimes a bit too sugary, a bit too simplistic. But I like the fact that it is low stakes. In a sense, it's not about the destruction of the world or evil mages. The problems are relatively small. And I wanted to write a winter story. I wanted to write something that feels very Christmassy. And so on day 1, I remember going for a walk, asking myself, what is this story going to be about? What can I write easily? And then I don't know how I came up with it, but the image that I had was of a young woman who would run basically like a cat cafe, or, you have some of those cafes or bars nowadays where you go there and cats are sitting on your lap, and it's apparently very, very good for people to calm down, etc. I figured, well, what if I do that, but instead it's dragons, It's a dragon cafe. So I said, okay, so who is going to be the protagonist? And then it was like, dragons? Wait, I wrote a book about dragon riders. What if it's one of those team members who gets ill? That was, of course, inspired by the cause of the project. What if that dragon rider gets chronically ill and she cannot continue to ride dragons, and so she ends up going back to her grandma in a small town in the winter, and then she has to reinvent herself and maybe start that dragon cafe. Now, thankfully, I did some research. I figured this is such an obvious idea. Maybe it's already been done. And by golly, it was. I found a book, and it was exactly that concept. When I read the reviews, I still haven't read the book, but it was very different from what I ended up writing. But it was like a good reminder that always do research before you start writing, because before you know it, you're going to be accused of copying someone else's idea. So I figured, okay, it's not going to be a cafe. I'm going to place this in the magical world of Dragon Patrol. What if they find magical creatures and they have to build a shelter for them or something like that? And it's not just dragons, not just baby dragons. It's many different fantasy creatures. Anyway, started to write every single day. And it was so much fun. Oh my gosh, I'm in love with this genre. It was such a pleasure to write. The hardest part for me was not to go overboard with all the action. I was so used to writing these epic stories where there's always massive dragons and big mafia type of criminal syndicates. I couldn't do all that. That would be outside of the genre. But I think I've figured out a way to write a story that still has quite a bit of character development. It's got a lot of cozy stuff. It's got like basically all the creatures, all the fantasy creatures are cats, but they look like dragons, or they look like, I don't know, like rock monsters, but they all behave like cats. I don't know why. I had a very similar experience of the experience that I had writing it was very similar to my Dragon Patrol experience. So the first half of the book was completely made up as I went. No idea what I was doing, where the story would go. And at the halfway point, I had already fallen behind a little bit, so I knew that Christmas was... I had missed like 3 or 4 days. Because there was this other project that I will tell you about in a minute, which basically was a full-time job that all of a sudden I started to work on next to writing this novel. The novel was supposed to be my day job, and now I had to combine it with another day job. It was insane. I pulled not really all-nighters, although the penultimate chapter, I finished that at 3:30 in the morning. That's almost an all-nighter. That's insane. I think most of my days in December, I worked for 12 or 14 hours every day, just writing. But at the halfway point, I knew that I had to start plotting. I knew I had to start putting all the threads together, become much more intentional about where the story was going. And I wanted to really pay off all the character arcs, and especially the main character. And I want to do it in a way that wasn't cheap, because that's kind of my issue that I have sometimes with these cozy fantasy novels. It's so low stakes that you turn the last page and you're like, yeah, so what? You know? So I started to add also a lot of my personal life lessons in it, things that I struggled with. And I think that helped the story quite a bit. So about that other job that I all of a sudden got. So I think I was like 2 or 3 chapters into this project, and I had already committed myself to finishing it because, it was a fundraiser. So I wasn't just writing this for myself. Someone else's life, or at least health, depends on this partially. And then I got the call that a pilot episode of a podcast that I created more than a year ago, had finally been greenlit. Now, the concept of that was that it would be a daily podcast about saints, and every podcast episode would be a story about a saint, the saint of the day. The pilot that I had developed was even before I started writing seriously, but I was already in a mood, and the pilot was based on, let's not just do a boring historical overview of like Saint so-and-so was born in this year and then did this and this. Let's write it as an adventure story. Let's do a cold open and a cliffhanger, and then just be super sensory. Like, I want people, if they hear the podcast, it's like an audio play. They are there. And I imagined I added sound effects and music. It was like a movie in your head. So that is why it got greenlit. They loved it. It was like, okay, give us more of this. And then ultimately, so in the start of November, the first week of December, I got the commission of writing 260 episodes. One saint every workday of the new year. And not only was I supposed to write it, but also to record it and to edit it. That, ladies and gentlemen, was so much harder than I thought it would be, because it's one thing to come up with a fictional story where I determine the rules. I can make up whatever I want, but this was also these are all historical people. You need to do your research. And I had someone who was assigned to me who does a lot of the research. But what I end up is having pages and pages and pages of historical information. And sometimes, of course, it's all, it's just more legends depending on the saint and how long ago that person lived. But then I had to, my job was to condense everything and to turn that into storytelling and to make it exciting. That was super hard. That took me forever. And so I ended up writing 20 scripts for the first month, for the month of January. I then recorded all of them here in the studio, and I'm currently still working on editing them. But it is definitely, it's like twice the amount of time that I scheduled for it. So this is incompatible with full-time writing. It's just not possible. It's too much. And that is why I spent so many days of December burning the midnight oil, just because I had committed to both these projects. There was no way back in my mind. And I pulled it off. Yesterday evening, I'd agreed to meet friends on New Year's Eve, and it's a tradition that we play board games. And so I knew that at 8 o'clock in the evening, I needed to be done with the book. And so I wrote the entire day until literally 7 o'clock in the evening, 7:30. At 7:30, I posted the last chapter. I was down to the wire. And I think I posted the update on Substack in the car. I don't even think it went out for some reason. Anyway, but the story was finished. We raised thousands of euros with the story, which is also a great help for that author. And I've got another book. It is 25 chapters. It is almost 70,000 words. I think it's 150 words less, but there will, of course, be an introduction, and I don't know. So that'll be 70,000. So that's another book. That's a pretty decent size especially for cozy fantasy. It's smack in the middle it's in the sweet spot. So I ended up writing 7 books in 1 year. I don't think I've ever learned as fast as this year. I've had a lot of different hobbies. I had to teach myself how to create documentaries and editing and whatnot, podcasting. But I learned the most from writing, from storytelling, and I don't think I can ever go back. This is the love of my life. The writing is the most fun I've ever had. So I'm already making plans for the month of January. I want to write another book. And in fact, here's my idea. This is going to be the year 2026 of publishing the books. So I'm going to have to reserve a certain amount of hours every day to do the editing, to work with an editor, and to make sure that these books are ready for publication, which they're not right now. Some books, like the first one, still needs a lot of developmental work. There's a lot of fixing that needs to be done. But I'm also more experienced, so hopefully that won't be that much trouble. But then, of course, it needs like better readers, and I don't know. It's a whole process. I've never done this before, except for the Cozy Fantasy book, where I did all the editing and even line editing every day. But I think I can pull it off, but it has to become another routine. So that basically leaves me with, I need to spend at least 2 or 3 hours on a podcast production. So I will probably, whatever I write, I'll have to write it during my lunch break, during my walks in the woods. That's a 2-hour window every single day. That's enough. I wrote Dragon Patrol just with 2 hours every single day. What am I going to write? Well, considering that I'm going to already start working on the editorial phase of the Story Mages And so basically I've got 2 books in the Story Mages universe and 2 books in the Dragon Patrol universe. I can do something different. What I'm currently thinking of is completing a cycle of in a total of 4 cozy fantasy novels, one tied to each season. So my current idea is to write another cozy fantasy novel, same size as the one I wrote in December. But this time I'm not going to publish it every day. I'm just going to write a draft. And it's going to be a spring story. And I already know, I have 2 ideas basically for what the story is going to be about. It's obviously going to have at least the same protagonist, maybe even other characters as well. I'll probably gather some feedback from the readers of the first book. And if all goes well, I will have that cozy fantasy novel ready at the end of the month with even some time to spare. So I've got, January is a long month. What I want to do is to take the first week, this week, to give myself a little bit of a time to breathe. So what I want to do is to write a lead magnet, a very short story. And it's going to be about one of the characters in the cozy fantasy book that I've just published. There's this monk. He's got a backstory. I'm going to write that story. I think it's going to be 20,000 words. And I'm going to write it between now and Monday. That's the plan. So it has to be finished on Monday. Then on Monday, I will start writing professionally. And again, I won't be able to write full time, but I have a very good feeling about it. There's part of me that even thinks of, well, if this goes well, I might even pull it off to write maybe already part of the 3rd book as well. My goal is to have those 4 cozy fantasy novels finished around April and start the editorial process in April, so that I can then have them all published once the fall arrives. Because the fall is usually when people start buying cozy fantasy books. But I know that if you want to be successful at marketing those books, you need to have them for sale a few months before that. So summertime is going to be hopefully the time when I'll be able to publish all 4 of them. And then we'll see how far I get with the Dragon Patrol series and with the Story Mages. But that would mean first quarter of the year, focusing on finishing that whole cozy fantasy collection, because series sell better than just individual books. And then I want to get the other books out. The story collections are probably the easiest to get out on the market. And then I want to write at least 1 more Dragon Patrol book and 1 more Story Mages book. So it's going to be 3 books in the Cozy Fantasy series, 1 Dragon Patrol book, 1 Story Mages book. So that's 5 full novels and then editorial work. And maybe I'll write more. Maybe I'll do some more short stories because I love writing those as well. But that's kind of the plan right now. So there you go. That's everything I have learned this year. And a little bit of a reveal of what I'm planning to do this upcoming year. Now, all that, of course, is still subject to change. You never know how things will go. I did not expect to write this many books, but I know that I've learned a lot, so that hopefully this next year will be even smoother sailing when it comes to writing. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much. Keep following me on Substack and on YouTube if you want to stay up to date, and make sure to be subscribed to my newsletter as well on Substack. It's free, and every week I'll let you know what I'm writing, what I'm cooking, and especially when I start publishing, I will need some beta readers. I need some people that will write reviews. And so anyway, definitely open for some help in that area as well. So thank you so much, and talk to you later.